Friends, welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is our first of two Before You Read lectures on the Gospel of John. This Before You Read lecture will provide a brief orientation into the Gospel as a whole, as well as an overview of its potential historical context in which it was written, and a few notes about how to read the first 12 chapters of the Gospel of John, the sorts of things to be on the lookout for in this material. To begin with an orientation to the Gospel of John, the first thing to note is that it has widely and very early been recognized as a unique or a distinctive gospel among the New Testament writings. In comparison to Matthew and Mark and Luke, which are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they can be seen together as one in like a set of columns, the Gospel of John tends to follow its own directions. It doesn't necessarily follow the timeline provided by the Gospel of Mark, as do both Matthew and Luke, nor does it include the whole list of characters and events that we might be accustomed to seeing in the Synoptic Gospels. So just a couple of examples. The first is that the Gospel of John has some significant omissions, things that it doesn't include in the story about Jesus. And these include things like the Last Supper and even the Transfiguration. These events some scholars would say have been reinterpreted. So maybe they are present in the Gospel of John, but not in the ways that we see them in the Synoptics, or they're simply not included there. There are also a whole set of characters in the Gospel of John that play a significant and important role that we don't meet in the Synoptic Gospels. Here I think about someone like Nicodemus, who we will meet in John chapter 3. And Jesus has this long and developed conversation with Nicodemus, or the Samaritan woman in the next chapter. And these unique characters really, I think, highlight another distinctive element of the Gospel of John, and that is the way or the manner in which Jesus speaks. You may remember that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus seems to use parables a lot, and his speech tends to be shorter and very contextual driven. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus talks a lot, y'all. He talks and talks and talks. And he often talks in a way that draws on metaphorical or ironic or symbolic language. And so we see characters who ask Jesus questions, and the conversation moves in interesting and not always super clear ways. A final thing to note of distinction with the Gospel of John is that it seems to account for 3 different visits to Jerusalem for Passover in the public ministry of Jesus. There's 3 mentions of Jesus going up to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now, since this Passover only occurs once a year, this suggests that Jesus had a 3-year public ministry. The timeline in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, however, has what appears to be a 1-year timeline, or less. Jesus goes into Jerusalem for the Passover at the end of the Synoptic Gospels, but that's it. That's his only visit, because of what happens in the temple or what happens in Jerusalem ultimately leads to his death on the cross. So the Gospel of John offers us a very different chronology for Jesus' ministry. And Jerusalem is important in the public ministry of Jesus. He seems to be going up and back and up and back a number of times to Jerusalem. The Gospel of John has been referred to as the spiritual gospel, and this has to do with especially its more theologically developed portrait of Jesus, especially Jesus' divinity, but also is one way of accounting for all of those differences that I just mentioned. That the Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us the earthly account, perhaps closer to the historical version, and the Gospel of John offers us the spiritual, or it fills out the deeper meaning of Jesus' words and actions. The Gospel of John is widely regarded by New Testament scholars as the last of the four New Testament Gospels. That is to say that it was written latest in the New Testament. There's a good bit of debate about when this occurred, although sometime in the last quarter of the first century is probably likely. Although there's a pretty strong contingent of scholarship that suggests a much later date, late first century or early second century as well. Talking about the date of writing for the Gospel of John relates in significant ways to how scholars and interpreters imagine its historical context. The context out of which the Gospel of John was written, and the context to which it was responding. Compared to the other New Testament Gospels, the Gospel of John has the most hostile relationship between Jesus and the Jews. In Jesus' earthly ministry, the Jews, and not just the Pharisees and the scribes, but the Jews, this sort of general term, it seems, there's constant conflict between Jesus and the Jews, and between the Jews and followers or would-be followers of Jesus. And this has suggested to interpreters, much like we saw with the Gospel of Matthew, that here we have a blending of the story of Jesus and the story of the community that's associated with the Gospel of John. There seem to be clues and places in the Gospel of John where we can see a painful separation between followers of Jesus and the larger Jewish society or community. And it seems as though some form of Jewish religious leadership in particular had a role in carrying out or enforcing this separation. It seems as though this was tied to claims about the divinity of Jesus, about the idea that this man from Nazareth was in fact divine and shared in the divinity of the God of Israel. One of the things that I'll encourage you is to read John 9 slowly, and read it with an eye for the ways in which the story of the community sort of peeks through the story of Jesus. For this, before you read lecture, I'm inviting you to go into John chapters 1 through 12, the first 12 chapters. This really gets us into the final days, the final hours of Jesus' life on earth, as we did with the other Gospels. This is we have a two-part break with John, sort of everything that happens up until that last 36 hours or the last week, and then from that last week into his resurrection. And so as you read these 12 chapters, first note, some of these chapters are very long, just in terms of the number of verses. So that's something to be aware of and prepared for. But as you read, first, pay attention to the titles that are given to Jesus. How do characters in the Gospel of John refer to Jesus? And what is the meaning or the significance or the function of these titles, do you think? Second, it's always a good idea when you're in the Gospel of John to slow down when Jesus is in an extended dialogue with another character. These dialogues often have a teaching element for subsequent readers like us. We are able to overhear these dialogues and we learn about Jesus, maybe even more so than the character who Jesus is speaking with, because more often than not, that character or those characters fail to grasp what Jesus is really trying to communicate. So be on a lookout for the ways in which dialogue is functioning and how understanding and misunderstanding are a part of those dialogues. A couple of other sort of elements, and some of these will carry over into our next reading with John 13 through the end, and that is, notice that John describes Jesus's powerful deeds or actions, he describes them as signs. Not miracles, not necessarily healings, but as signs. Signs are something tangible that point to a reality beyond themselves. So when you see Jesus doing certain signs, it's a good idea to ask, what do these signs point us to? What about Jesus or his mission or his identity? What do these signs indicate about Jesus? And finally, pay attention to the I am statements. There's about 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. Statements where Jesus says quite clearly who he is or what his role is. And so pay attention to those. Maybe just have a list going as you read. Well, lots of information in this lecture. Hopefully it makes some sense. Hopefully it makes your engagement with the Gospel of John all the more effective. And I can't wait to hear what you see. Happy reading.